It is my pleasure on behalf of the Teachers College to present Dr. Margaret Mead, who will speak to us on cultural influences on the youth generation. Dr. Mead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the community, I was recently asked at about 2 a.m. in the morning by some anthropology students in Cincinnati what they thought my major contribution had been, and I said to live as long as I had. It's very clear from your introduction that that's the way it should be phrased. When I address a student audience, I think the first thing that's necessary is to tell them firmly how old I am. You know, age is more important than sex these days. And I was born in December 1901. I was in college, is where you are now, from 1919 to 1923. And that's just the point when we realized that all the dreams of a united world under the League of Nations were failing, and that sooner or later we would have another world war, which we had. And I was in college at a point that people thought religion was sort of settled forever. They were making projections ahead. We were never going to build another rural church, and probably not a city one either. We were making projections about the population, which was going to steadily decline and get older and older, and we were never going to build another elementary school or another orphan asylum, and all the orphan asylums were going to be turned into old ladies' homes. The population was in other forms of danger because girls from the Ivy League colleges only had 6/10 of a child per woman. And people talked about the dire effects on the quality of our population. This was also a period when we passed the immigration bill, excluding as much as possible immigrants from Southern Europe, because we knew they never would adjust to the United States. You just looked at their IQs in school, and they weren't as high as the people who'd been here before, and therefore quite clearly they just never were going to be able to measure up. And it wasn't so many years afterwards that New York City had a choice of 3 candidates for mayor, all Italians. You could take your choice, but you got Italians. I think it's valuable whenever anybody talks to you to place them as accurately as you can and keep their age in mind. You know, keep in mind what things mean to me as compared with what they mean to you, and keep making a few useful comparisons. There wasn't any general radio then. Radio was just beginning to come in. People had earphones and tried to get power and by fiddling, but there were only sort of radio pros. And I remember the first Thanksgiving dinner when we had radio broadcasting a football game, and my future sister-in-law said, "This is the last time we'll ever be able to eat celery." And of course there were no TV and no talkies. Movies were quite important, and there were people who thought they were going to wreck our characters. There were people who were sure the automobile had wrecked our characters. It was responsible for people never going to church. And then there were also the fact that girls were cutting their hair. And this was practically the beginning of the end. It's interesting, they didn't make as much fuss about girls cutting their hair as they do about boys not cutting it. So that is regarded as more serious. Because we're still in a state where we're up to date, we'd be more worried about what boys do than what girls do. Whether that's going to continue, we're not quite clear. Now, in talking about the present situation in the world, and the situation that we speak of as a generation gap. I want to make as clear as I can, and this is rather hard to do, I find, that I am not talking about gaps between parents and children. Lots of people have had a gap between themselves and their parents, or between themselves and their children. Every time that we've had any kind of major break in continuity, as when Europeans came to this country speaking a foreign language and their children went to American schools and became Americanized and only spoke English, there was a gap between those parents and those children, and there was more of a gap between them and their grandparents. Whenever there was a major convulsion in the world, at the time of the Protestant Reformation, for instance, there was a terrific gap between Protestant children and Catholic parents. And we had religious wars that lasted over 100 years as a result. There was a terrific generation gap undoubtedly in Rome, in ancient Rome, when Christianity took over from the ancient pagan religions. And there are terrific generation gaps in New Guinea, when a boy may be studying medicine whose father was a cannibal. This is probably the biggest gap between a father and son that we've ever registered. But maybe I better stop and try this out again. Now, is this better or worse? Can you hear in the balcony? Good. If I get too near or too far and you can't hear, why, if you wave your hands, I can see it. But this is not what I'm talking about when I'm discussing the generation gap. And I don't think it's what anybody's talking about. Many people think they are. But I think what we're talking about is something very different. And that is that in the 1940s, we had a change in the world, the like of which we've never had before. It maybe wasn't greater than the gap and things that happened at the fall of Rome, but when Rome fell, the rest of the world didn't fall, and a large proportion of the rest of the world didn't even know Rome existed and couldn't have cared less. In the past, we've had events occur in one part of the world, but the rest of the world has gone on. This time, the whole world has been involved in the same changes, whether people live in New Guinea, or Samoa, or Peking, or Tokyo, or Moscow, or New York, or Muncie. The same things have affected all of us. The invention of the bomb, which meant that now the human race could destroy itself, all of it, and so we had a new responsibility in the world. The whole electronic revolution, which meant space exploration and television, and events on one side of the world seen immediately on another. The whole technological revolution, which meant computers and automation. All of these things have happened at once, so fast and so coincidentally that they were too fast for the parent generation to absorb. In the past, when there have been changes, adults have learned the change and have been able to teach their children what had happened. If you go back and look at the first generation of people who drove motor cars, and occasionally you see these in an old movie, and once in a while you see the way people looked, the first generation that tried to drive an automobile, and they sat with backs absolutely ramrod straight, holding onto the wheel as if it would get away from them. They'd all learned to drive horses, and horses did get away from them. In fact, one of the very interesting statistics is that more people were hurt by horses proportionally than are now hurt by automobiles. Every family had somebody who broke their neck from a runaway horse. There weren't very many horses and there weren't very many people, but there were a lot of broken necks proportionally. But the first generation who treated an automobile as if it was a horse, and we did this in many other ways too, we put the engine where the horse had been instead of where it ought to have gone. They learned to drive an automobile, and their children sat beside them and watched that stiff back And when they were old enough to drive, they slid under the seat and relaxed. And we had a new style of driving automobiles. And it was possible. Change was still slow enough, also we lived through an enormous amount of change, so that adults could learn about each change as they happened. 1946 wasn't so that we have a real break between all the young people who were born and grew up since 1945 and all the people who grew up before World War II, with the 25 to 35 sort of in limbo. And nobody knows quite where they belong, and they sort of wear sideburns and try to bridge the generations. Some of them feel more like the younger people, and some of them feel more like the older people, and hopefully they'll be interpreters. But the oldest members of the inhabitants of the post-World War II world, the native-born inhabitants of this world, are now 25. And it was about 5 years ago that we began hearing about the generation gap. Because up to the time they were 20, they couldn't make much noise. And they didn't get into very much trouble. But by the time they were 20, they began taking a look at this world from the point of view of their birthright position and asking inconvenient questions. And we suddenly started talking about the generation gap. One of the things we said was, these impossible young people, they don't like anything, but they haven't any plans for change. Why don't they tell us what we ought to do? I don't think we really meant that, but we thought if they presented a plan, we could knock it down. But they didn't present any plan at all. They just said it's all no good. Take it apart. But of course, there isn't any reason why people of 20 should have a plan for the future. In the past, when we've had young people involved in new movements of any sort, they got all their plans from adults. They all had adult leaders who were using college students as part of whatever change they wanted to make. Democratic or communist or fascist or whatever it was. The plans came from grandfather in most cases, or even great-grandfather. I haven't figured out how many grandfathers we ought to put to Marx's name, but quite a lot. I think that's a good thing to do. I'll work on that. Because he seems to be still around every once in a while. Now, and nobody expected 20-year-olds to have utopian plans. Now, they were then 20. Now, the oldest members of this new generation are now 25. And in 10 years, they'll be 35, and in 20 years, they'll be 45. And they'll still be the senior members of the new generation. And it will be a very different world from what it is now. Because what we've had to date, and we're just getting over the edge of it now, all the native-born were so young. And they were all in school. Almost all of them. And if they weren't in school, they were the age of people that are in school. We weren't taking them very seriously. And it was a terrific responsibility for them to try to raise any questions vis-a-vis the whole, what they call the establishment, which is any committee that's been elected for more than 15 minutes, usually. And they had no models anywhere. Now, this is the other very interesting point about this generation gap. That even if you were the first people in your family, or in a group of immigrants that had come from Europe or Japan or somewhere, to speak English and go to American schools and brush your teeth American style, you had models. There were the other kids that were there already, and you could copy them, and so we developed in this country an enormous dependence on peer groups. And the teachers were there. If your parents didn't know how to speak English, the teachers did, and other people's parents did, so that there were always models for young people in some older people somewhere. There were people who had lived through the appropriate experiences to be the kind of grown-up people that they were. And then we suddenly confronted this position, which we have today, in which no one who grew up before World War II has ever had the experience of growing up afterwards, and in which we have this very curious contrast, you know. Older men used to be able to look a young man in the eye and say, "Young man, I have been young, but you have never been old." And you know the rest of that sentence. But today, the young people can say, if they're smart, they say, "Sir, with all due respect, you have never been young in the present day world, and there is no way in which you can recapture in any way the experience that we have had, just as we will never be who you are, because we never had the experience of being young in the world you grew up in. And because there's nowhere on this planet's surface is there any group of people who had that experience. So there's nowhere to go to another country to find models. We have to work them out as we go. And of course we have to work them out cooperatively between the pre-World War II generation, who have all the power, all the expertise, all the leverage, and who are going to be here for a long, long time. See, after all, the youngest of them are 36. They're going to be here quite a long time, and they're not going to retire till they're 70. So the only thing to do is to settle down and accept that we've got a world that's filled with two generations of people who are immigrants here in this period in time and have to learn about it the way immigrants do, and one young generation who were born here but don't know very much about it yet. Now, one of the very striking things that I've been watching and asking questions about is why, when young people are included in discussions with older people, why they're so angry, and why, on the whole, they ignore history and act as if nothing had ever happened before, and they don't want to hear it had been, if it had. But I've come to the conclusion that only if they ignore history do they have a chance of talking at all. Because otherwise somebody tells you what happened in Rome and says Rome fell and we will, or something of the sort, and they never know enough about Rome to answer back. And so that the only contemporary position that's been very tenable today has been to say history doesn't matter. Now, of course, it does matter, but this has been a defensive maneuver, and after I spent several hours with high officials from the Foreign Service while they told me that human nature never changed and you could learn anything you wanted from studying Roman history, and there was no reason for they should listen to anybody today, I was a little sympathetic with the people that were willing to dish history. Yet, of course, if they dish it, they have no grounds for comparison at all. And the anger is primarily because the weight of knowledge that exists in the world today is so much greater than it's ever been. Now, this is, of course, worst in science, but it's great even in the humanities. I mean, when people studied the humanities 40 years ago, of course, they didn't use the word then. What they studied was literature, or the Romance languages, or something of the sort, or philosophy. They didn't have to be responsible for China and India and Japan, as well as for Europe. The world began with Greece, and that's all you had to learn. And you could ignore the whole rest of the world happily. And there was a fair chance that one could read the most important books in the world and have some understanding of what they were about. So that it's not only in the sciences that the tremendous accumulation of information just weighs down on one's head, but in any field. All the new media and cheap paperback books, all of these things make so much available that it's almost impossible to stand up and buck it. And yet, in a sense, this is partly what people have to do. Now, the implications of this state that we're in, of course, one of the things we could do is just say, let's wait. And a lot of people have been saying, one of the things that parents say particularly is, just you wait. Just you wait till you have to earn your own living. Just you wait till you're married and have a child. Just you wait till you have to pay the mortgage on the house, and you'll find out. In fact, this is one of the things that makes students rather nervous. And some of my students, ask me, will I become a conservative? Not a conservative in the sense of was one a revolutionary radical, but will I lose all the new sense of what needs to be done in the world and move back to the kind of people who say that the beautiful lake where the University of Wisconsin is situated has always been polluted and it always will be. Why should anybody do anything about it? Lake was there, is there, will be there, and it'll be just like that. And students wonder, is that the way I'll talk 20 years from now? And then we have some quite interesting things, because we know how students talked in the early 1950s. Time magazine did a survey of what they called campus leaders. I don't know what campus leaders are called today. They're a little harder to find. But in the early 1950s, we knew what a campus leader was perfectly. He was going to be a man in a gray flannel suit. He was going to be organization man. Every time he looked in the glass, he looked to see if his tie was tied like a junior executive. And he was a campus leader. So they interviewed him. And they asked him where they thought they'd be 15 years hence. And they described the richest and most successful member of their family and said that's where they'd be. In the same kind of house, in the same kind of suburb, with the same kind of station wagon. They didn't even bother to invent a new model. But today, students of the same sort are primarily concerned with saying, of course I'll be older, and I'll probably be married, and I'll be living with the responsibilities of someone that's older, and I'll be able to vote and so on. But I'm not going to lose the sense of the new things that have to be pursued. I'm not going to give up the knowledge that I have now of what needs to be done. And that knowledge simply springs from a difference in experience. There are people who think this generation is brighter than the previous generations. I know too much about genetics to think that. I don't see any reason to believe it's brighter. Even though taxi drivers, say today, they're born brighter. But they are better informed than any generation has ever been before. It's fantastic to compare the educational level of people from 18 to 21, where 78% of them have graduated from high school, with the educational level of the population in 1940 when 20% had graduated from high school. So they are the best educated group that we've ever had. And when we look at this contrast, we then begin to consider what kind of a world we're going to be able to build between a generation that has a different view of what's happening. Because I think this is the most accurate thing that we can say. If you've never known a world without the bomb, you know that it's possible to destroy the human race. But people who grew up before the bomb don't really quite know it. They may know it in a textbook style. If you've never known a world without space exploration, you look up in the sky and you think about satellites. But people my age think about the sun and the moon and the stars and the Milky Way and an occasional comet. And that's all that ought to be up there. And we have difficulty remembering. Now, I've worked on high school students' attitudes towards satellites, and we did a great deal of interviewing, and all over the country right after Sputnik went up, and I've been working on space for years. But the day of the moon landing, I was in Greece, off Delos, I came out on the deck and looked up and saw the moon. And for about 20 seconds I saw the moon that used to be there. The moon that man would never reach. The moon that philosophers used to discourage speculation because man would never see the other side of the moon. The moon that the Air Force had to have a crash program to remap because astronomers who thought we'd never go there mapped it backwards. And that was the moon that I saw. And then, of course, about 20 seconds later I said, but they're up there. But it took that long. And I remember being out in Ohio the summer that Echo first went around, and the telephone company kept saying, you can see Echo tonight at 6:21. And this was the first time that the whole population really began paying attention to space. But if you interview 14-year-old boys today, they say, when I was young I was interested in space. But now I'm much more interested in how we deal with the inner city. Putting away childish things. They've seen that landing on the moon, preparation for landing on the moon so often they're tired of the astronauts' cake. And this is the sort of difference that we're dealing with. Not a difference in virtue. I don't think even a difference in idealism, but a difference in point of view. A difference between living on the whole planet and knowing that there is no one on this planet except one human species. Whether they're tiny little pygmies or tall Nubians or Chinese sages. They have the biggest heads. That there's nobody here but us, Homo sapiens. And we've got to put up with ourselves. And of knowing that we are the people that are going to have to make the changes that will make this earth habitable again when we've been endangering it by our headlong use of technology, which we're spreading all over the world. Now, this series of lectures is specially sponsored by the Teachers College, and I am supposed to relate what I say particularly to problems of teaching, which to a degree affect all of us now, whether we're students trying to revise the curriculum or teaching assistants rebelling at the University of Wisconsin. Incidentally, the teaching assistants' rebellion at the University of Wisconsin illustrates what I've been saying, that it isn't 20-year-olds now who are the oldest members of the generation gap, people on this side of it, but it's 25-year-olds. And so it isn't students that are rebelling now, it's teaching assistants that are rebelling. And this is what's going to happen everywhere. The youngest teachers and the youngest doctors and the youngest lawyers are going to be the spearhead of change. And students in high school are now going to be able to look at young people ahead of them. They won't be old enough to be parental models, but they'll be old enough to be big brother models. They won't be all alone, the oldest people in the world that know what's happening at 20, which is very gloomy in many ways. It's made a lot of students very gloomy. Now, one of the tremendous implications of this exceedingly rapid change that we're living in is the effect that it has on teachers. Because teachers used to be able to teach in the light of the children they once were. Most of the teachers of the world became teachers because they had good teachers. A lot of the teachers they had weren't good, of course. But if we go back into the history of people who become teachers, they had at least one teacher who fired their imagination enough so they wanted to be teachers. And if they taught the way that teacher taught, and taught children that were like the child they'd been, they were good teachers. And it didn't make much difference what methods they used. If you look around the world, you see the most peculiar methods being used. but they turned out literate populations just the same, whether the children all sat and chanted out loud and were never allowed to ask a question, which was true in Chinese education, or whether, as in Eastern Europe, Jewish schools, they lived in cold and misery and torn books, and a teacher that called them all the names in the calendar. And you can't imagine anybody would like it, but the people that went through it then end their descriptions, and there the love of learning was born. And it was, no doubt about that. It was born there. And people who went to our little country schools and were taught by some young man who maybe later became the President of the United States, or young men 18 years old on the way to being lawyers and statesmen. They grew up and taught other people and taught them successfully. And we had things handed down from people who knew how to do them and imparted to other people. And as long as the people being taught were the same kind of people, this worked. Now, the minute we got into a situation where the people being taught were different from the teachers, we had some trouble. And we began having a good deal of trouble in our inner city schools around the turn of the century, where the teachers were teaching children that they had never been and whom they didn't understand. And they didn't know what was in the children's heads when they spoke to them. And so our very successful forms of general education and universal education that we invented weren't as efficient in 1920 as they'd been in 1900. And they were even less efficient in 1940, and they're frightfully inefficient in 1970. Not because the teachers aren't as good, they're probably better, they've been better trained, but because they're teaching strangers. They're teaching children who are so strange to them that where teachers used to get better every year, and I can remember the old teachers in the schools I went to, they were marvelous. They'd been there for 30 years and they'd taught 20 Joneses, and they knew about those Joneses. And they knew children, and they knew what they were up to, and they knew how much they could stand, and they knew when the room was in a state of mind that something was going to blow up, and they knew how to stop it. And they were at home in their schoolrooms. And then we began looking at teachers who got worse every year instead of better. Worse and worse and worse, and they said the children were awful, and they were disturbed, and the children got more and more disturbed until whole classes were disturbed. And teachers began resigning early, retiring as early as they could because they couldn't take it anymore. These children, one of the best teachers I've ever known, and she was very, very successful, and she taught the whole city, more or less. She always called them children, 18-year-olds who were getting married, who were being drafted, who were being entrusted with bombs that might start a war that would blow up the world. But she still called them children. And after a while, she didn't like the way the children behaved. So she retired. And the gulf between teachers who taught as they had been taught and children who were very different widened, and then we began sending the children to college in large numbers. Hundreds of thousands of children whom we still treat as children in many ways, because we still treat students as not having full adult status. If you drop out from high school and get a blind alley job in a garage and get married, you're a full adult human being. You get unemployment insurance, you can have a telephone with no trouble, you can sign a lease, you're grown up. But if you stay in college till you're 35, studying some complicated form of neurology, all the time you're there, you're treated partly as a child. And this has made a tremendous difference in what's going on in the world. And furthermore, another thing that has made a great difference is that today there's a climate of opinion that's very strong in this country and is beginning to be strong in other places, that says that every person who is having something good done to them should have a voice in what's being done. Now, we've had a lot of confrontations in the past as we freed slaves and freed serfs and worried about the conditions of miners and factory workers and got child labor out of the mines and all of these things. But these were all rebellions against bad people. We couldn't free slaves until we decided it was bad to own them. We couldn't free serfs until we decided it was bad to have a feudal system. We couldn't have safety devices in the mines until we decided that it was bad to have mines in which people were killed and which they developed all sorts of occupational diseases. So that most of the changes in the past have been changes by exploited people and on behalf of exploited people against someone who was doing evil of one form or another. And it wasn't until almost everybody agreed it was evil that you could do anything about it. Now, the new kind of climate that's spreading in the world is against people who are doing good, and usually pretty badly paid for doing it. This is one of the definitions of doing good, of course, that you're badly paid. Because obviously if you weren't badly paid and good, you wouldn't have taught school in the United States in the last 50 years. You wouldn't have been a nurse. You wouldn't have been a social worker. These were all occupations that involved dedication and poor pay. And teachers and college professors and social workers and nurses and physicians all worked hard on behalf of the people they cared for, the pupils and the students and the clients and the patients and the parishioners. Of course, the clergy were very badly paid too and were very good. At least were completely committed to what they were doing that they thought was good. Now suddenly all of the people who've been done good to appear to be rebelling. The students say we want to take part in planning the curriculum. The patients in the hospital say we want to take part in our cures. That's shocking. I mean, we've always treated patients as if they were feeble-minded, you know. Taken everything away from them, called them by their first names, waking them up at 5 in the morning and washed their faces and never told them what was wrong with them. And the idea they want to take part in things. Welfare mothers. Now this is really the final blow. I mean, here society are paying taxes to help those welfare mothers. And you know what they say? They say they'd like to plan when they're given money for their children's shoes. You know, they say we'd like to get the money in September when they have to go to school instead of February. This is shocking everybody. And so we have right across the country, and this affects teaching enormously, because after all, half the population is in school. People who have all their lives been doing what they thought was the best thing for somebody else, and these thankless others are all demanding a part in the action. And furthermore, they're demanding it now. You see, all people involved in good works have been able to wait 20 years, 25 years, and appoint another committee and do another piece of research. Take the thing slowly. Make it sound. Think it over. And we used to say you couldn't tell whether a college president was a success for at least 25 years. If we tested college presidents by that today, you know, we wouldn't have any successes. Hardly. And so we're getting this tremendous emphasis on something being done now. The patients want to take part in things while they're in the hospital. The welfare mothers want the shoes the month their children go to school. And the students want something to happen while they are here. They don't want to plan for a class 10 years from now. They want to take part in the planning for themselves. And this is affecting teaching everywhere. We have a great deal of many aggrieved college professors who feel that they spent their lives doing things for students, and those ungrateful students are rebelling against them, And you can't convince them they're not the same students that they wrote that recommendation for 25 years ago. They think of all the recommendations they wrote, and they feel very, very aggrieved. They say they're just going to retire and write books, things like that. So this is affecting the whole relationship between teachers and students everywhere in the country. And then I've been trying to think over why the California state system has had so much trouble when it looked like a very, very progressive system. There were so many good things about the state system in California. Higher education was free. You didn't have to stay in one college. You could get bored with Santa Barbara and go to San Diego. You could drop out of school and go back in. It was a place for everybody, and you had retired admirals sitting next to teenagers. You could start over. If you'd done very badly in high school, you could get into a community college and pay attention and start over. There were so many things that looked very good. And yet the California system has been manhandled worse than any other system. But nowhere in the California system was there any place for any participation by students in what happened. And yet those students were taxpayers. Large proportion of them worked. They were young adults. They were taxpayers. They earned their automobiles and got there at 6:30 in the morning and slept in their cars to find a parking place. Many of them had full-time jobs, and they weren't participating. So that they were just on the edge of something and had no part in it. And I think that's one reason that we've had the kind of difficulties in California. Because it doesn't make so much sense to insist on things in a kind of college where the college lives on what some rich families gave them 150 years ago. But if you're citizens and taxpayers and actually paying taxes, and it's a tax-supported institution, you get a slightly different sense of participation. And California was almost entirely public, and there were very few private institutions to modulate it. And there was no place where the recipients of the education played any role. Now, what is going to happen everywhere, I think, in education is that we're going to blur the distinction between teachers and pupils. That we once had students who were taught by teachers. The teachers learned everything they needed to know when they were young, and they taught it forever after. We ran our colleges on a sort of medieval principle that was developed before books were invented. You know, the professor had one manuscript, just one book. That made him a professor. The students came with blank pages, and he dictated slowly, slow enough so they could all write it down. When they went away, they had one book. And then we invented printing, but nobody noticed it. And we still have a system in our universities in which a professor takes down notes from his professor, who read them slowly, and he reads them slowly for the next 40 years. And the students are compelled to go and take them down. Sometimes they can get copies from their fraternity house, but we really haven't discovered printing yet. This medieval style. Now and people, of course, could be teachers all their lives with an occasional refresher course to get an increment in salary. Now, I think all this is going to change. We're not going to have lifelong teachers and students who are finished up, given a degree and turned out of a sausage machine. But instead, we're going to have the kind of situation in which instead we have people who are sometimes teachers and sometimes students, where everybody is learning as well as teaching, which means, of course, we're going to have educational centers which include nursery schools, because somebody's going to have to be studying the nursery school children all the time to find out who they are, because nobody will know, because there'll be a new kind of child brought up with a different kind of television, And they will know things that the adults don't suspect them of knowing, and they won't know things that the adults think they know, which is one of the other extraordinary things. I had a small friend, or a child of a friend of mine, who had gone to a church school. He hadn't even gone to a public school. He'd gone to a church school all his life, and suddenly he said in a loud, clear voice in a restaurant where everybody could hear, "Who were Adam and Eve?" Never heard of him. You know, he must have missed the lesson that day, and it was never repeated. And so that when we look at children, we find they don't know masses of things we think they did, and they know all sorts of things that we would never have suspected them of knowing. So if we're going to teach them, we have to keep studying them and find out what they do know, what they're interested in, what they understand about the world, so that educational institutions in the future, I think, are going to be places where people come in and out also, of course. You go out into the world and work and discover you don't know enough to get the kind of job you want, and come back, go to school again, and while you're going to school you're teaching some younger people whatever it is you happen to have learned while you were out. People will change their occupations maybe 3 times in a lifetime. And people will learn by teaching, which is the best possible form of learning that we know about. Because learning is not distinctively human. All sorts of creatures learn. Even a fly learns. The most primitive kinds of insects learn. But the only people that teach are human beings. And teaching something makes one conscious of it, and makes one understand it. And one of the outstanding things that is happening in the world today is the fact that we are now living in a world of which we are becoming increasingly conscious. The thing that will save us is our knowledge of the world we live in. A sufficient knowledge of the world we live in so that we can think ahead, we can plan, we can take the necessary steps, we can stop defiling the earth, our habitat. This button that I'm wearing is the Wisconsin Earth Day button. I don't know, I haven't seen any buttons around here yet. This is their button for April 22nd teach-in about the environment. And we know that we've got to rescue this environment. We know that we've got to deal with the population explosion and deal with it fast. We know that we've got to be ever alert against the dangers of scientific warfare that might wipe us all out. But we know also that we have the tools to do this. We have a sufficient understanding of the world we live in that with the help of a computer, we ought to be able to make the necessary plans. But the necessary plans will be made by people who understand and are conscious of what's happening. And the way you become conscious of what's happening is to teach it to somebody else. Get it in a form that's manageable. And if instead of teaching the children to run the television set and never teaching grandfather so he's always getting it untuned in some form or other, we had taught grandfather how to use the television set and let him teach the children, we'd have had much more manageable grandparents. And this is the sort of thing that we're going to have in the future.